The bell of the Sterling silver mine was the first and last voice Coyote Ridge heard each day. It rang at dawn, a summons of iron and obligation that shook red dust from the pine shingles of the town's tired roofs. The sound rolled down the single muddy street past the general store and the saloon and the land office before echoing off the high, snow-capped peaks of the Sawatch Range. For most, it was a call to work. For Eleanor Boone, it was a call to sleep. She stood on the porch of her small cabin watching the new shift of men trudge toward the gaping mouth of the mine, their lunch pails glinting in the thin morning light. The high plateau wind pulled at the stray strands of brown hair she kept cut short to fit properly under a helmet. It was a practical choice, but one that earned her more than a few sideways glances in town. A woman with short hair was almost as unnatural as a woman who worked a mine. Eleanor was 28 years old and a widow. Her hands were calloused from stone and timber, her back and shoulders darkened by the sun from the 1 year she and Hank had tried to farm this unforgiving land before the mine swallowed him. Now she worked the night shift to keep this small patch of ground their small pine cabin, and to raise her brother Evan. She owed the mining company for the cabin, and she owed Evan a future that did not smell of damp earth and blasting powder. She turned and went inside the cabin. Evan was still asleep, a lanky 14-year-old boy tangled in his blankets. On the small stove, a pot of coffee was nearly ready. The smell of it mingled with the scent of whale oil from the lamp she had just cleaned. She poured a cup and sat at the small wooden table, mending a tear in her thick leather gloves with a heavy needle and waxed thread. Her movements were precise and economical, born of exhaustion and necessity. Later, she walked into town, her empty flour sack in hand. The sun was higher now, burning off the morning chill. Coyote Ridge was a town built on a ledge of hope and silver ore. Its buildings were unpainted timber, and its citizens were a mix of Cornish miners, Irish laborers, and grim-faced speculators. As Eleanor passed the saloon, a burst of loud laughter spilled out. She kept her eyes forward, her jaw set. The smell of whiskey always brought back the memory of Hank's funeral, the clumsy condolences of men who had shared a drink with him one day and buried him the next. Mayor Ephraim Pike stood outside the land office speaking with Vance Cutter, the mine foreman. Pike was a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, a politician who mistook his own importance for the town's prosperity. Cutter was lean and wiry, with a face that seemed permanently fixed in a sneer. He was the man who had hired her out of what he called a fit of Christian charity and reminded her of it whenever he could. They both watched her approach. Mayor Pike nodded curtly, his smile not reaching his eyes. Cutter just stared his contempt, a palpable thing. To them, Eleanor was a stain on the town's rough but proper order. She ignored them and stepped into the general store. The place smelled of coffee beans, dried apples, and dust. She bought her flour on credit, the storekeeper marking it down in a thick ledger without comment. As she waited, she heard men talking near the stove. The talk was of a railroad tycoon, some fellow from the east named Silas Hart, who was rumored to be coming to look over the Sterling. They said he was buying up mines and laying track all over Colorado. The county was even considering a new line right through Coyote Ridge. The men spoke of it with a feverish excitement, a promise of better pay and a brighter future. Eleanor listened without expression. A new owner meant new rules, and new rules rarely favored people like her. Back at the cabin, Evan was awake and eating a piece of leftover cornbread. His face was bright with the unlined optimism of youth. He talked about learning the telegraph, a trade that felt as modern and magical as the horseless carriages people were starting to talk about back east. She listened, letting his chatter wash over her. "I will work until he is old enough," she promised herself for the 100th time. "I will work until he can send messages with wires instead of digging for silver with his hands." Her deepest fears lived in the darkness of the mine, with the groaning timber and the stale air a collapse like the one that took Hank. Her other fear walked in the daylight. It was Vance Cutter. That evening, as twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and deep blue, she prepared for her shift. She pulled on her heavy boots and canvas trousers. From a small wooden chest in the corner of the room, she took out her helmet and lamp. Buried at the bottom of the chest beneath a spare blanket was a small lace kerchief, her wedding handkerchief. She touched it for a moment, a ritual of memory before closing the lid. She did not want to forget the man Hank had been, but she could not afford to dwell on the man she had lost. The mine demanded all of her attention. Rosalia Vega, her closest friend, found her on the porch, checking the wick on her lamp. Rosalia owned the small Mexican eatery next to the livery stable, a place of warm smells and warmer smiles. She was a woman with a generous heart and a sharp tongue. She pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into Eleanor's hands. It was still warm. "For you and Evan," she said. She looked Eleanor over, her expression a mixture of worry and pride. "Be safe in there," she murmured. Eleanor nodded her thanks, too tired for many words. Inside the bundle were fresh tortillas and beans, a kindness that felt as sustaining as a prayer. A little later, she got a piece of advice from Song Li, the cook for the Chinese railroad crew camped just outside of town. He was an old man with wise eyes who had seen more explosions than he cared to count. He showed her how a pinch of salt in the whale oil could make the flame of her lamp burn brighter and cleaner. A small trick, but one that could mean the difference between seeing a cracked timber and not. She thanked him, grateful for the shared knowledge of survival. As the night shift bell began to ring its deep, resonant toll across the valley, Eleanor walked toward the mine. The great timbered entrance loomed like the mouth of a sleeping beast. Other miners nodded to her, their faces smudged with dirt and fatigue. She was a fixture now, a part of the rhythm of the place, even if she was not welcome. She paused at the entrance, looking into the profound darkness. "Going to work, Hank," she whispered to the cool night air. The words were a habit, a private farewell to the ghost she carried with her. She was just about to step inside when the bell began to ring again, not in its usual steady rhythm, but in a long, frantic peal, a signal for trouble. Men started shouting, their voices tight with alarm. An accident, a rock fall in one of the secondary tunnels. Panic began to ripple through the crowd of miners waiting to go on shift. But Eleanor remained calm. She saw two young miners, barely older than Evan, stumble out of the entrance, their faces pale with shock. A length of rope had come loose from a pulley and snagged a cart, sending it careening off its tracks and causing a small slide. No one was badly hurt, but the passage was blocked. Without a word, Eleanor moved past them into the tunnel's opening. Her lamp cast a steady yellow glow on the scene. She sized up the tangle of the cart and the fallen rock. She found the end of the loose rope and with practiced hands began to tie a secure knot to a thick support beam, giving the other miners a safe anchor point. Then she looked at the two shaken boys. "Get back," she said, her voice low and even. "Let us clear this." She guided them back toward the entrance, her movement steady and sure. In the flickering lamplight, she was not a woman in a place she did not belong. She was a miner, a leader in all but name, standing her ground against the dark. The immediate danger had passed, but the air in the mine's entrance remained thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the displaced rock and timber. Eleanor had just finished coiling the rope when the smell hit her, a faint, acrid scent that was not the familiar odor of damp stone and blasting powder. It was the smell of gas methane, a pocket of it somewhere deep in the labyrinth of tunnels disturbed by the day's blasting. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the reach of their lamps. Before she could shout a warning, a low rumble vibrated through the soles of her boots. It was followed by a muffled roar from deep within the mine, a sound like the world clearing its throat. The lamps around them flickered wildly, their flames shrinking to tiny blue points before flaring up again with a hungry orange light. A wave of hot air rushed out of the tunnel mouth, carrying a cloud of thick dust. Men staggered back, coughing and shielding their eyes. It was Tunnel 3, a gas explosion. Vance Cutter shoved his way to the front, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Get back," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "All of you get back." His eyes found Eleanor. "And you," he snarled, pointing a grimy finger. "The woman stays out." But Eleanor was already moving. She ignored him. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand. She knew Tunnel 3 better than anyone, having worked that seam for 6 months straight. She knew its weak points, the places where the timbering was oldest. She grabbed a heavy wooden beam from a nearby stack, her muscles straining with the familiar weight. Another miner, a Cornishman named Thomas, saw what she was doing and moved to help her without a word. The entrance to Tunnel 3 was choked with smoke and debris. A support beam near the entrance had cracked and was groaning under the immense pressure of the rock above. Just beyond it, a man lay crumpled on the ground, his lamp extinguished. It was Finn, a young Irishman with a wife and a new baby. "The woman stays out," Cutter yelled again, his authority dissolving into impotent rage. Eleanor paid him no mind. She and Thomas wedged the fresh beam into place beside the splintering one, shoring up the crumbling ceiling. It was a temporary fix, a desperate gamble against gravity. As soon as it was secure, she scrambled over the fallen rock toward Finn. She checked for a pulse and found one faint but steady. She hoisted him over her shoulder, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and began the slow, painstaking retreat back to the main tunnel. Just as she cleared the entrance, the splintered beam finally gave way, and a section of the tunnel roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of rock and dirt where she and Finn had been moments before. Out in the open air, the crowd of miners and townspeople who had gathered at the sound of the explosion let out a collective gasp of relief. A few men even started to applaud as Thomas helped Eleanor lower the unconscious Finn to the ground. But the applause died as quickly as it had begun. As Eleanor stood up, brushing dust from her trousers, the relief in the crowd curdled into something else. The familiar expressions of suspicion and resentment settled back onto their faces. A voice from the back of the crowd, a rough miner's drawl, yelled out, "Looks like she has struck a new vein. A real gold digger." A wave of cruel laughter followed. Mayor Pike, who had arrived to oversee the situation, his face puffed with self-importance, shook his head slowly. "It is an unnatural thing," he declared to the men around him. "A woman's constitution is not suited for such emergencies." One of the ladies from the Coyote Ridge Virtuous Women's Society, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, sniffed disdainfully. "She is a disgrace to her gender putting on such a show. She belongs at home, not in a man's world." Eleanor stood there, her body screaming with exhaustion, her ears ringing from the blast. She had just saved a man's life, yet she was being judged and condemned. She looked down at her boots caked with mud and rock dust, and a wave of weary anger washed over her. Why, she wondered not for the first time, did a person's decency have to be approved by a committee. Dr. Whitcomb pushed his way through the crowd, his black bag in hand. He was a cantankerous old man with a sharp mind and no patience for foolishness. He knelt beside Finn, his gnarled fingers expertly checking the young man's breathing. As he worked, his nose twitched. He picked up a damaged lamp that had fallen near Finn's body and brought it close to his face, sniffing the oily residue. His brow furrowed. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself. He stood and walked over to Eleanor, his gaze sharp. "The oil in these lamps," he said in a low voice. "It smells cheap. Cut with something else. Something that burns too hot and sputters." He did not need to say more. Eleanor understood immediately. Cheap oil meant faulty light and a greater risk of sparks. In a gassy mine, a single spark was a death sentence, and the only person who ordered supplies was Vance Cutter. When she finally made it back to her cabin, the moon was high and cold in the star-filled sky. Her muscles ached with a deep bone weariness. She opened the door and her heart lurched. Evan was sitting at the table, his face pale in the lamplight. He had followed her. He had seen everything. He jumped up and ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist. "I was so scared," he whispered, his voice muffled against her canvas shirt. She held him tight for a moment, her anger and fear for him warring with her relief. Then she pushed him back, holding him at arm's length. "What were you thinking, Evan?" she said, her voice harsh with emotion. "You are never to come near that mine, you hear me? Never." "I want to learn," she said, his eyes pleading. "I want to be able to help like you." "You will help by staying here and keeping the stove lit," she snapped. Her anger softened as she saw the hurt in his eyes. She pulled him into another hug, this one gentler. "You will learn your letters first, Evan. You will learn to read and write. The mine has 100 ways to swallow a man whole, and most of them are written on warning signs that fools cannot be bothered to read." The next day, the town was buzzing with talk of the explosion. In the saloon, the jokes were coarse and frequent. Someone had drawn a crude caricature of Eleanor, a muscular figure with her short hair and a pickaxe slung over her shoulder, and pinned it to the wall. That evening, Rosalia saw it. Without a word, she walked over, tore the drawing from the wall, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the hot belly of her kitchen stove. She did not say a word to Eleanor about it, but Eleanor knew her friend had her back. A late frost had settled over the high country, and the wind that blew down from the Sawatch Range was dry and biting. The snow on the peaks was beginning to melt in the strengthening sun, sending trickles of water down into the earth, making the mine damper and less stable than ever. At night, Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the mournful howl of coyotes from the gray hills, a sound that seemed to echo the hollowness inside her. She counted each breath a small victory against the darkness that was always waiting. 3 days after the explosion, the mail rider brought a letter for Mayor Pike. The news spread through Coyote Ridge like a brush fire. Silas Hart, the railroad and mining tycoon, was coming. He would arrive in 1 week to conduct a full inspection of the Sterling mine with the intent to purchase it. The town was thrown into a frenzy of speculation and excitement. A new owner, a railroad line. It was the promise of a new era. For Eleanor, the news was a knot of ice in her stomach. She remembered the day Hank had been brought out of the mine, his body broken. The foreman at the time, a man long gone, had called it a tragic accident. A faulty lamp, he had said, with a shake of his head. But Eleanor had seen the lamp later. She had smelled the same cheap foul oil that Dr. Whitcomb had identified. Someone had cut corners to save a few dollars, and her husband had paid the price. She had sworn an oath over his grave, a quiet vow that she would never let such a thing happen again. She would not stand by while men profited from the blood of good miners. That evening, Dr. Whitcomb stopped by her cabin. He sat at her table, sipping the strong coffee she offered him. "It's a rotten business," he said, his voice a low grumble. "This town. They would rather praise a man for the polish on his boots than for the quality of the timber he uses to hold up a mountain. Around here, they respect a man with grease on his mustache more than one with grease on his support beams." Eleanor looked out the window toward the dark shape of the mine. Silas Hart was coming, and she knew that when he arrived, she would have to make a choice. She could stay silent and protect her job, or she could speak the truth and risk everything. Coyote Ridge expected a spectacle. The arrival of a man like Silas Hart, a tycoon who moved mountains and bent rivers to his will, was cause for the town to hold its breath. They anticipated a private rail car, a carriage with polished brass, and a retinue of clerks in city suits. What they got was a lone rider on a steady gray horse. The man was tall and lean, his frame draped in a long dust coat that had seen too many miles to remember its original color. He rode into town not with a flourish, but with a quiet deliberation, his gaze sweeping over the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, and the expectant faces of the townspeople. His eyes were the most remarkable thing about him, not for their color, but for their intensity. They were the eyes of a man who did not just look, but saw. Whispers followed him as he dismounted in front of the livery stable. "This is the tycoon. This is Silas Hart." Eleanor did not see his arrival. She was at the mouth of the Sterling mine, locked in a familiar argument with Vance Cutter. The air coming up from the main shaft was stale, heavy with the scent of spent powder and human sweat. "The ventilation is not right, Vance," she said, her voice low but firm. "The new crosscut is blocking the flow to Tunnel 4. We need to run a secondary flue." Cutter spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boots. "We need to pull ore, Boone, not play with air shafts. The flow is fine. It is just your womanly nerves getting the best of you. Now get to your work." Behind him, a small group of miners listened, some with sympathy, others with amusement. The lone rider had walked up from the stable, his approach silent on the hard-packed earth. He stood just behind the miners, a dusty statue observing the scene. Eleanor only noticed him when she tried to step around Cutter. She found her path blocked. "Excuse me," she said without looking up, her patience worn thin. "You are in the way." The man stepped aside without a word, but then he spoke, his voice calm and even. "What is the standard for timbering in a shale seam like this one?" Eleanor stopped and finally looked at him. She saw the dusty coat, the observant eyes. She did not know who he was, but the question was a serious one, not the idle curiosity of a townsperson. She gave a serious answer. 12-inch pine beams set 4 feet apart with cross-bracing every 20 feet. But the company has been sending green wood. It warps. The man nodded slowly, his eyes moving from her face to the timber stacked near the mine entrance. And the lamps. What is the burn time on a full reservoir? They are supposed to last a 12-hour shift, she replied, her voice sharp. But the oil they supply is poor quality. We are lucky to get 10 hours and the flame is unsteady. He looked at her for a long moment, and then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a look of acknowledgement, a sign of respect that she had not felt from any man in Coyote Ridge since Hank had died. Before more could be said, Mayor Pike came bustling up the path, his face flushed and wreathed in a sycophantic smile. "Mr. Hart, welcome to Coyote Ridge. We are honored, absolutely honored. Please forgive our rough ways. Let me show you the fine foundations of our community." Pike steered Silas Hart away from the mine and its inconvenient truths. He led him on a tour of the town, pointing out the new steeple on the church and the neat rows of houses where the respectable families lived. He made a wide detour around the mining company's supply yard, where stacks of warped green timber and barrels of cheap, foul-smelling oil sat baking in the sun. Pike spoke of order and decency and the bright future of Coyote Ridge, all while carefully concealing the rot that lay just beneath the surface. Silas listened politely, his face revealing nothing, but his eyes missed little. He noticed the slight sheen of oil on the puddles in the street, an oil that smelled faintly of the same acrid cheapness he had detected at the mine. He saw the way the new church steeple listed slightly to the west, a testament to the same green wood he had seen stacked for the mines. He took a small notebook from his coat pocket and made a few brief notes, his pencil moving with a quiet efficiency. He did not make accusations. He did not form conclusions. He simply observed and recorded. That evening, Eleanor sat with Evan at their small cabin table. The meal was simple stewed beans and a piece of cornbread each. The wind had picked up howling around the corners of the cabin, a lonesome sound that seemed to magnify the silence between them. Evan was full of talk about the telegraph again. He described how a man in Leadville could tap a key and send a message all the way to Denver in the blink of an eye. Eleanor listened as she ate her calloused hands wrapped around the warm bowl. "The telegraph is a good trade," she said, her voice carrying a dry humor that Evan knew well. Less dust than ore, anyway. Later, Silas Hart walked into Rosalia Vega's eatery. The small room was warm and filled with the smell of chili and fresh tortillas. Rosalia greeted him with a polite nod, her dark eyes assessing the newcomer. He took a seat at a small table in the corner and ordered a cup of coffee. As he sat there, he noticed something in the ashes of the cold hearth, a piece of crumpled paper that had not fully burned. He could just make out the crude lines of a drawing, a caricature of a woman with bulging muscles and a pickaxe. A few miners at the counter were talking in low voices, their words drifting over to him. They spoke of the explosion of the unnatural woman who thought she could do a man's work. One of them laughed. "She works like a man, all right. Hard as a mule and twice as stubborn." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. It was strong and bitter. Perhaps he set his voice just loud enough to be heard by the men at the counter. Perhaps we have been misjudging men. The miners fell silent, turning to look at the stranger in the dusty coat. Rosalia looked over from her stove, a slow smile spreading across her face. That night, the wind grew into a gale. Hard pellets of hail hammered against the tin roof of Eleanor's cabin, sounding like a frantic drumbeat. She lay in her bed listening to the storm and thinking of the mine. The rain and hail would seep into the ground, making the tunnels slick and the ceilings heavy. It was another weight added to the already immense burden the earth placed on the men who worked beneath it. Mayor Pike was also busy that night. He moved through the saloon buying drinks and spreading his own version of the future. He told the men that if Silas Hart bought the Sterling mine, he would bring the railroad. The railroad would mean more jobs, higher wages, and a direct line to the smelters in Denver. It would mean prosperity for everyone. He painted a picture of a bright and shining future for Coyote Ridge, a future that depended on making a good impression on Mr. Hart. He did not mention that a sale to Hart would also bury any investigation into the shoddy supplies and faulty equipment that had almost cost Finn his life. He was selling the town's future to hide his own past. In his room at the town's only boarding house, Silas Hart sat by a single lamp cleaning the dust from his boots. His hands were strong and capable, but as he worked, the lamplight caught the faint white lines of old scars across his knuckles, a latticework of healed burns and cuts. He had not always been a tycoon. He had started his life laying track for the Union Pacific, his days filled with the ringing of a sledgehammer and the searing heat of steel. He knew the weight of a shovel and the ache of a strained back. He understood the language of sweat and labor. Power and wealth had not erased those memories. They were a part of him, a moral compass that still pointed true. He looked out the window at the dark outline of the mountains. He had come to Coyote Ridge to assess a mine, but he was beginning to understand that he would also have to assess its men, and its one remarkable woman. A makeshift platform had been erected in the town square, constructed from the same green timber that propped up the Sterling mine. The whole of Coyote Ridge seemed to be in attendance, their face turned upward toward Mayor Pike, who was currently introducing Silas Hart with a stream of flowery praise that made the dusty air feel even thicker. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd near Rosalia and Dr. Whitcomb. She had come to listen, not to speak. She wanted to hear what the tycoon had to say to gauge the measure of the man who held their futures in his hands. Silas Hart stepped forward, quieting the crowd with his stillness. He wore the same dusty coat, his lean frame silhouetted against the bright Colorado sky. He did not begin with pleasantries or promises. He spoke of his initial findings in a calm, factual tone. He mentioned geological surveys, timber quality, and ventilation systems. The crowd grew restless. This was not the talk of railroads and prosperity they had been promised. A man in the front, a miner named Jed, who was a loyal follower of Vance Cutter, shouted out, "What about the silver? Is there still silver in that mountain or not?" The question broke the tension and a wave of murmuring followed. The focus shifted from the man on the platform to the issues on the ground. Another voice rang out a jeering taunt aimed at the edge of the crowd. "Ask the woman, miner. She probably knows where the real treasure is buried." Heads turned. Eyes found Eleanor. The collective mood of the town, a volatile mixture of hope and fear, found an easy target. The taunts grew louder, more pointed. "She does not belong here. This is business for men. Send her home to her kitchen." Mayor Pike, sensing the shift in the crowd, raised his hands in a placating gesture. Now, let us maintain our decorum. Perhaps it would be best if Mrs. Boone allowed the men to discuss these matters." He gave her a condescending smile. "For the sake of propriety." Eleanor's first instinct was to turn and walk away, to retreat to the quiet solitude of her cabin. But then she thought of Hank, and of young Finn lying unconscious at the tunnel mouth. She thought of the cheap oil and the splintering beams. She could not walk away. She held up her hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture demanding silence. In her hand was a small metal plate, the reflector from a miner's lamp. It was blackened and warped. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were clear and carried the weight of truth. "The lamps we are given are a danger," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the miners in the crowd. "The oil is cut with impurities, causing the flame to flare. This reflector plate warped from the excess heat in a single shift. In a gassy tunnel, that flare is a lit fuse." Vance Cutter, who stood on the platform beside the mayor, let out a short, ugly laugh. "A lit fuse. She talks like she is an explosives expert now." He turned to the crowd, his voice dripping with scorn. "What does a woman know about gas pressure and combustion points?" Before anyone could answer, Silas Hart moved to the front of the platform. He had been watching Eleanor, his expression unreadable. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the sneering foreman and the flustered mayor. He looked at the proud, defiant woman standing alone against their judgment. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring of the crowd like a razor. "The town shamed her for working the mine." He said his words slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. The tycoon said, "That's the woman I want." A stunned silence fell over the square. The jeers died in the throats of the men who had uttered them. Mayor Pike's jaw went slack, and his forced smile looked like a grimace. Vance Cutter's face darkened with a mixture of shock and fury. Down at the edge of the crowd, Rosalia leaned over to Dr. Whitcomb and whispered, "I can get behind that kind of wanting." The doctor grunted in response, long as he does not want the rest of the mine for free. Silas let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he continued his voice, clarifying his meaning before any other interpretation could take root. "I did not come here to buy a mine that is on the verge of collapse," he said, "and I will not be swayed by men who value $1 more than a life. I want a person of integrity, a person with first-hand knowledge of the dangers in that mine to oversee its safety." He looked directly at Eleanor. "I want to hire Eleanor Boone as the interim safety forewoman for the Sterling mine. She will have the authority to halt any work she deems unsafe, answerable only to me." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of voices, some in disbelief, some in anger, and a few in quiet approval. Evan, who had been watching from the porch of the general store, stared with wide eyes, his chest swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. His sister had been scorned, and in the next breath she had been honored. Vance Cutter stepped forward, his professional pride wounded. "You cannot be serious," he sputtered. "She is a woman. She has no experience leading men." Silas Hart's gaze was like flint. "She has the experience of saving a man's life while your foreman ordered her to stand back. That is all the experience I require." Eleanor was speechless. The offer was a lifeline, a shield, a weapon all at once. It meant money to send Evan to telegraph school. It meant the power to protect the men she worked alongside. But it also felt like a trap. She looked at Silas Hart, her expression wary. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hart, but my opinion is not for sale." "I am not trying to buy it," he replied. "I am trying to put it to good use. I will have a shipment of new lamps and properly seasoned timber brought in from Denver. I will bear the cost myself." "You cannot buy my silence," Eleanor said, her voice regaining its strength. "You can only buy good timber." "That is all I ask," he said. "The truth. Whether I buy this mine or shut it down for good depends on what the truth is." She considered for a long moment. She saw the desperation in the eyes of the other miners and their wives. She saw the smug confidence on Pike's face begin to crack, and she saw in Silas Hart a seriousness that she could not deny. "Very well," she said. "I will accept the position, on a temporary basis, until you have your answers." That night, long after the town had settled into an uneasy quiet, two figures walked toward the mouth of the Sterling mine. Their lamps cast a single pool of light, pushing back the immense darkness. Inside, the air was cool and damp. The only sounds the drip of water from the ceiling and the crunch of their boots on the gravel floor. They walked to the entrance of the collapsed tunnel. "The rockfall is unstable," Silas observed, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "It was the cheap oil," Eleanor said, pointing her lamp at a dark scorch mark high up on the rock wall. "The flare from Finn's lamp must have hit a small gas pocket. The explosion was small, but it was enough to shake the rotten timbers loose." He ran his hand over a nearby support beam, the wood soft and damp to the touch. "Green pine," he said, his voice tight with a cold anger. "It is a wonder the whole mountain has not come down." They stood there for a long time in silence, not as a tycoon and a miner, but as two people who understood the unforgiving nature of the earth and the high price of carelessness. The light from their lamps merged, casting two long shadows that stretched and danced on the damp stone walls, a silent testament to an unlikely and dangerous alliance. Change came to the Sterling mine not like a rockfall, but like the slow, steady drip of water. Eleanor, now in her official capacity as safety forewoman, moved with a quiet authority that unsettled the old rhythms of the place. She carried a thick ledger, and in it she noted air quality readings, timber integrity, and shift durations with meticulous care. She rerouted the flow of ore carts to avoid the weakened sections of Tunnel 4 and implemented a new cross-ventilation system that, while slowing the work slightly, made the deep air taste cleaner, less like a tomb. At first, the miners grumbled. They were men accustomed to a certain level of risk, a fatalistic dance with danger that they considered a part of the job. Her new rules felt like an intrusion, a fussy overcautiousness they associated with the world above ground. But then they saw the stacks of new, seasoned pine timbers arriving on a wagon train from Denver, paid for by Silas Hart. They handled the new safety lamps, their flames burning with a bright, steady glow that cut through the darkness with a reassuring clarity. The grumbling subsided, replaced by a grudging respect. They began to see that her caution was not born of fear, but of a deep, abiding knowledge of the mountain's treachery. The shift in attitude was marked by a moment of rough humor. A young miner, barely a man, flustered by her sudden appearance in a side tunnel, stammered, "Begging your pardon, forewoman, ma'am." Eleanor stopped and turned, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. She stared at him until the silence became more uncomfortable than any reprimand. The other men in his crew froze, waiting for the explosion. Finally, she spoke, her voice flat. "I have a hammer." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Let's just stick with Boone." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crew, breaking the tension. From that day on, she was simply Boone, a name that carried the weight of their newfound respect. Silas Hart spent his days at the mine, not in the foreman's office, but down in the tunnels, observing, listening, and taking notes in his small ledger. He rarely gave orders, preferring to ask questions, but one morning, he attempted an act of domesticity that proved more hazardous than any geological survey. He built a small fire outside the mine office and tried to brew coffee. The result was a thick, black sludge that smelled of scorched earth and despair. Eleanor found him staring into his tin cup with a look of profound disappointment. "Trying to brew a fresh batch of tar." "Mr. Hart?" she asked, her lips twitching with a suppressed smile. He looked up, a sheepish expression on his face. "I confess, my talents do not extend to the culinary arts." She took the cup from him, sniffed the contents, and grimaced. She reached into a small pouch on her belt and shook a tiny pinch of salt into the cup, stirring it with a twig. "Try it now." He took a cautious sip. His eyebrows rose in surprise. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a rich, smoky flavor. "How did you do that?" "An old trick to cut the acid," she said. "Works with bad coffee and sometimes bad tempers." They shared a small smile, a moment of easy camaraderie in the cool morning air. He looked down at his hands, at the old scars that mapped his history. "Reminds me of a time laying track in Nebraska," he said, his voice quiet. "We ran out of supplies for 3 days. The foreman boiled old coffee grounds with chicory root. It was so bitter it could strip paint, but it was hot. On those nights, hot was all that mattered." It was a small confidence, a glimpse into the man he had been before he was a tycoon, and it built a silent bridge between them. While they navigated the delicate truce at the mine, Rosalia and Dr. Whitcomb were conducting their own investigation, pleading a need for old billing records to settle a dispute with a supplier. Rosalia had gained access to the mining company's office, while she distracted the clerk. The doctor, with his surprisingly nimble fingers, located the invoice ledger for the previous year. And there it was, an order for 500 gallons of whale oil from an unknown supplier in a distant territory, signed for by Vance Cutter. The price was a third of the standard rate. Stapled to the invoice was a disbursement voucher, approved for emergency supply, and signed by Mayor Ephraim Pike. It was the proof they needed, a paper trail leading directly from the faulty lamps to the 2 most powerful men in town. As men dug for evidence on paper, nature was preparing its own testimony. The spring thaw was accelerating. The snow on the high peaks melted under the relentless sun, and the ground became saturated. In the mine, new seams of water began to appear on the tunnel walls, tracing dark, wet paths down the rock. The constant dripping became a permanent part of the mine's soundscape. The air grew heavy with moisture, and the timbers, especially the old green ones, began to swell and groan under the increasing pressure. The pressure from outside the mine was also building. A small delegation of investors from Denver arrived, Men in clean suits and polished boots who looked deeply uncomfortable in the dusty, chaotic environment of Coyote Ridge. Pike and Cutter led them on a carefully curated tour, but Silas insisted they speak with Eleanor, one of the investors. A man with a ledger for a soul pointed to a note in Eleanor's logbook. Forewoman Boone, you have suspended all blasting in Tunnel 2. That represents a significant reduction in output. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. The ceiling in that tunnel is weeping water. The vibrations from blasting could bring it down. A reduction in output is better than a reduction in the number of men who go home to their families. Before the investor could retort, Silas stepped forward. I have seen Mrs. Boone's notes, and I have seen the tunnel myself. Her assessment is correct. The safety of the men is not negotiable. He looked from the investor to Eleanor and back again. I will listen to the one who knows the mine, not the one who knows the profit ledger. The investors exchanged uneasy glances, but they did not argue the point again. Unable to challenge Eleanor on professional grounds, Pike resorted to another tactic. The following Sunday, the town's preacher delivered a sermon on the sanctity of the natural order. He spoke of the roles ordained by God, of men built for the hardship of labor and women for the gentle stewardship of the home. He never mentioned Eleanor by name, but every person in the congregation knew who he was talking about. A wave of murmurs and sideways glances washed over the pews. Eleanor, sitting in the back row with Evan, did not flinch. She kept her head held high, her gaze fixed on the stained glass window, her silence a more powerful statement than any angry retort. The weight of her new position and the town's judgment settled on her shoulders. She felt a growing connection to Silas, a respect for his quiet strength and unwavering fairness. But she was wary of the feeling. Her heart still held the ghost of Hank, and her life was defined by two clear priorities: keeping her brothers safe and keeping the miners alive. There was no room for anything else. She deliberately kept a professional distance between herself and Silas, a small, guarded space that he seemed to sense and respect. Silas, for his part, was careful not to impose. He was a man used to command, to having his vision become reality. But with Eleanor, he moved with a quiet deference. He would ask her opinion before making a decision. He would stop at the threshold of the small office she had claimed for herself and wait to be invited in. It was a respect for her autonomy that she found more reassuring than any compliment. As her shift wound down, she made a last, unhurried pass through the main shaft. From somewhere deep below, a new sound rose, a low, resonant groan that wasn't the usual murmur of settling timbers, but something older and more burdened, like the mountain letting out a tired breath. Following it to a quiet spur off Tunnel 3, Section 3B, she stepped into air heavy with damp. The groan pressed closer here. She laid her palm on a broad support beam and felt a distant, steady tremor. The mountain was moving. She returned to her office and unrolled a map of the mine. With a piece of red chalk, she drew a heavy line across the entrance to Tunnel 3B. In the margin, she wrote a clear, unambiguous order. Tunnel 3B is unstable. No entry under any circumstances, especially in the event of heavy rain. She did not know it then, but she was drawing a line between life and death. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It simply appeared, a sudden and violent tearing of the sky. The afternoon sun was swallowed by a mass of bruised purple clouds that rolled over the Sawatch Range with unnatural speed. A strange, metallic taste filled the air, and then the world went white with hail. Stones of ice the size of acorns hammered the tin roofs and dusty streets of Coyote Ridge, driving everyone indoors. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, and thunder cracked like the mountain itself was breaking apart. The townspeople huddled in the saloon, their faces lit by the flickering lanterns, their voices a low murmur of anxiety beneath the storm's roar. The rain that followed was a deluge, turning the red dust to a thick, running sludge. Creeks overflowed their banks, and the ground, already saturated from the spring thaw, could not absorb another drop. The mountain was drinking the storm, and deep in its belly, the water was prying at the stone and timber with immense, silent pressure. The news came with a man who was more mud than human, stumbling into the saloon with a face bleached by terror. "It is a collapse," he gasped, his chest heaving. "The whole ceiling of 3B just let go." A collective gasp went through the room. A woman screamed. "How many were in there?" Dr. Whitcomb demanded, already reaching for his bag. "3," the man choked out. "Thomas and the 2 new boys from Missouri." Eleanor, who had been standing by the door watching the rain, felt a cold dread seize her. 3B, the one section she had explicitly forbidden. She pushed through the crowd and grabbed the muddy man by the shoulders. "Who sent them in there?" The man would not meet her eyes. "It was Cutter," he mumbled. "He said Mr. Hart was not paying him to be cautious. He said we had to make our quota, storm or no storm." A low growl of anger went through the saloon, but Eleanor did not hear it. She was already out the door, running into the blinding rain toward the mine, the word quota echoing in her mind like a death knell. By the time she reached the entrance, a small, terrified group of miners had gathered. Silas Hart was already there, his face grim, his dusty coat soaked through. He saw her and came to her at once. "What do you need?" There was no time for blame, only action. Eleanor's mind was a flurry of calculations, her fear channeled into a cold, clear purpose. "Rope," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the storm. "Shovels, and every spare timber you can carry. I need a small team, men who are steady, not just strong." She picked 3 miners she trusted, men who had watched her work and respected her judgment. Silas stepped forward. "I am not a miner," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I am strong. I can carry the timber." He looked at her, his eyes stripped of all pretense of his station. He was just a man offering his strength. Eleanor nodded once. "We will need it." She looped a coil of heavy rope over her shoulder and handed another to Silas. "There is no foreman down there but me," she said, her gaze locking with his. "You follow my orders without question." "I follow your orders," he repeated, the words a solemn vow. The journey into the mine was a descent into a nightmare. The main tunnel was slick with mud, and a river of cold. Brown water swirled around their knees. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of wet earth and the faint, deadly sweetness of methane. As they neared the turnoff for Tunnel 3, the sound of the storm faded, replaced by the terrifying sounds of the mountains settling, the groan of stressed wood, the sharp crack of fracturing stone, the constant patter of falling debris. The entrance to 3B was a chaotic mess of shattered timber and rock. A wall of rubble blocked the main passage, but a small, precarious opening remained near the ceiling. It was their only way in. Eleanor took a piece of chalk from her pouch and drew 3 clear, vertical lines on the wall beside the opening. A simple code she had established in her first week. 3 lines meant a confirmed, safe passage out. They wriggled through the opening one by one into a scene of utter devastation. The tunnel beyond was half filled with water, the ceiling sagging dangerously low. They moved forward, their lamps cutting feeble paths through the oppressive darkness. Eleanor's heart pounded with every step, her ears straining for any sound of the trapped men over the rush of water and the creaking of the earth. It was she who found them, huddled on a small ledge of rock just above the rising water, one of the boys from Missouri clutching a badly broken arm. As they began the slow, agonizing process of moving the injured men back toward the opening, a new crisis erupted on the surface. Mayor Pike, his face a mask of panicked greed, tried to stop the other miners from setting up a safety perimeter. "You cannot shut down the whole mine," he blustered. "The financial loss will be catastrophic. We have investors to think of." Silas's chief engineer, a man who had been left in charge on the surface, tried to argue, but Pike would not listen. He was about to tear down a rope barrier when Silas himself emerged from the mine entrance, his face and clothes caked in mud. He moved with a speed that belied his lean frame, planting himself directly in Pike's path. His voice was not loud, but it held the cold, hard weight of iron. "You touch that rope, Pike, and I will see you in a federal prison for criminal endangerment. This mine is now a rescue site, and you have no authority here," Pike sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. But he shrank back from the absolute certainty in Silas's eyes. Underground, the mountain gave another shudder. A massive support beam just ahead of Eleanor's small party splintered with a sound like a rifle shot. The ceiling above them groaned, and a shower of rock and dirt rained down. Without a second of hesitation, Silas threw himself forward, shoving one of the injured miners out of the way and bracing his own back and shoulder against the sagging rock, absorbing the initial impact. His face contorted with the strain. "Now, Boone!" he grunted through clenched teeth. Eleanor was already moving, grabbing a spare timber and shoving it into the hands of the other miners. Together, they forced the heavy beam into place, shoring up the collapsing ceiling just as Silas's legs began to buckle. For a single, breathless moment, their eyes met in the flickering lamplight, a shared acknowledgement of the abyss they had just stared into, a bond of trust forged in the heart of the mountain. They brought the three miners out into the gray, storm-lighted afternoon. A cheer went up from the waiting crowd, a sound of profound, collective relief. Evan, his face streaked with rain and tears, tried to rush forward, but Rosalia caught him, holding him in a firm, steadying embrace. Dr. Whitcomb immediately went to work on the injured men, and then, just as the last man was clear, the mountain let out a final, deafening roar. The ground shook violently, and the entire entrance to the Sterling mine collapsed in on itself, a roiling cloud of dust and debris erupting from its mouth. Tunnel 3B, and the men who had been trapped there, were gone forever. A dead silence fell over the crowd. In that silence, Eleanor, covered in mud and trembling with exhaustion, walked directly up to Vance Cutter. In her hand, she held one of the cheap, warped lamps she had recovered from the tunnel. She held it up for all to see. "This is what you traded 3 men's lives for." "Vance," she said, her voice shaking with a cold rage. She looked at the crowd. "He sent them into a tunnel I had condemned. He did it to make his quota." The rescued miners, now conscious and aware, confirmed her story. Dr. Whitcomb stood up, his face like thunder. "And I have the invoices for the cheap oil that caused the first explosion," he declared, "signed by Cutter and approved by Mayor Pike." Cutter's face went white. He looked from the accusing faces of the miners to the cold, unforgiving eyes of Silas Hart. "I had to," he snarled, his composure finally breaking. "The company was squeezing us. I had to dilute the supplies to save a little money." It was a full confession, blurted out in a fit of rage and self-pity. Silas Hart turned to his engineer. "Get on the telegraph," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Contact the district judge in Leadville. Tell him we have 3 counts of manslaughter and a confession." Pike stepped forward, his face slick with sweat and rain. "Now, Mr. Hart, let's not be hasty. I am sure we can come to some sort of arrangement." But the town had turned on him. The crowd, which had once jeered Eleanor, now surged with a righteous anger. They shouted him down, their voices a unified roar of disgust. The town sheriff, seeing the tide turn so completely, stepped forward and placed a hand on Vance Cutter's shoulder. Eleanor watched it all as if from a great distance. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that was almost too heavy to bear. She stumbled over to the steps of the mine office and sank down, her head in her hands. She did not notice Silas approach until she felt a heavy weight settle over her shoulders. It was his dusty, mud-stained coat. He knelt beside her, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaotic aftermath. "You did wonderfully," he whispered, his voice so soft she could barely hear it over the sound of the rain. In the quiet, sodden aftermath of the storm, Coyote Ridge was a town holding its breath. The Sterling mine was silent for the first time in its history. its collapsed entrance a gaping wound in the mountainside. For many families, the silence was the sound of impending starvation. Their livelihood was buried under 1,000 tons of rock and mud. But on the second day, a notice was posted outside the general store, written in Silas Hart's clear, decisive hand. The mine would be closed for at least 2 months for a full structural reinforcement, until it reopened. Every man on the payroll would receive his full wages, paid from a private fund established by Hart himself. The town did not know how to react. It was an act of unprecedented generosity. Yet it came from an outsider, a man of immense power whose motives were still a mystery. Gratitude mingled with a deep-seated suspicion. They accepted the wages because they had to, but they watched Silas with wary eyes, wondering about the true cost of his charity. The change in the town's heart was not for him, but for Eleanor. It began with the 3 men she had pulled from the mountain's grip. Thomas, his arm in a sling, stood on the saloon porch and told anyone who would listen that he owed his life to Boone. The 2 boys from Missouri, their faces still pale with shock, echoed his words. They spoke of her calm, her skill with the ropes, her absolute refusal to panic in the face of death. The saloon, once the source of the cruelest jokes, fell silent when she passed. The crude caricature was a distant, shameful memory. One morning, she opened the door of her cabin to find a single, wild columbine, its delicate purple and white petals still wet with dew, laid carefully on her doorstep. She never knew which of the town's children had left it there, but the small gesture of respect felt more valuable than a pouch full of silver. The days found a new, quieter rhythm. Silas hired a crew from Leadville to begin the slow, dangerous work of clearing the mine entrance, but he spent most of his time at Eleanor's cabin. He arrived one afternoon with a small, brass-keyed telegraph sounder he had ordered. He and Evan sat on the porch for hours, their heads bent together as Silas explained the intricate dance of circuits and electromagnets. Evan, who had been quiet and withdrawn since the collapse, came alive again, his fingers tapping out clumsy, halting letters, his face alight with fascination. Eleanor watched them from the doorway, a pot of mending in her lap. It was a peaceful, domestic scene, and it unsettled her. As Silas was preparing to leave, Evan, with the blunt honesty of a 14-year-old boy, looked up at him and asked, "Do you have feelings for my sister, Mr. Hart?" A slow, dark blush crept up from the collar of Silas's shirt. He was a man who commanded boardrooms and bent senators to his will, but the boy's simple question had completely disarmed him. He cleared his throat and chose his words with the same care he used to assess a geological report. "I have a great deal of admiration for your sister's courage, Evan," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "She is a remarkable woman." It was a formal, proper answer, but the warmth in his eyes when he glanced at Eleanor told a different story. The courage he spoke of felt like a distant memory to Eleanor. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the fear she had held at bay came for her in the quiet moments. Her hand would tremble when she picked up a lantern to light the evening lamp. At night, she dreamed of the groaning timbers and the suffocating darkness, waking with the sound of falling rock ringing in her ears. She grew quiet and withdrawn, the trauma settling deep into her bones. Silas saw it all. He saw the tremor in her hands and the new shadows under her eyes. But he did not press her to talk. He did not offer clumsy words of comfort. He simply showed up. He would sit with her on the porch in the evenings, sometimes talking about the progress at the mine, sometimes just sitting in a shared silence that was more comforting than any conversation. He continued to brew his terrible coffee, though she noticed it was getting slightly less bitter with each attempt. He was learning. One afternoon, Rosalia stopped by, her presence a whirlwind of warm energy. "So," she said, her eyes twinkling as she watched Silas carefully measure out coffee grounds, "has the Tycoon learned to make coffee that does not taste like a punishment for past sins?" To her own surprise, Eleanor let out a small laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was genuine. The sound of it seemed to break a spell. letting a little light into the dark corners of her mind. A week after the collapse, the telegraph in the main office, now repaired, began to clatter. The operator scribbled a message on a pad and handed it to Silas. A wire from the district judge. A traveling court would be convened in Coyote Ridge in 2 weeks' time to hear the case against Vance Cutter and Ephraim Pike. The evidence, the message concluded, was compelling. Justice was on its way. The news seemed to solidify Silas's presence in the town. He was no longer a visitor, but a fixture, a part of the unfolding drama. That evening, as he and Eleanor sat on the porch watching the alpenglow paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold, he asked a quiet question. If I were to stay on for a while longer, would you find it a nuisance? She looked at him, at his serious face and the faint scars on his hands. She thought of his quiet patience, his unwavering respect. Only if you allow any more warped timber into that supply yard, she said, her voice dry, but with an undercurrent of warmth he had never heard before. The days after the storm were beautiful, filled with a clean, sharp clarity that only comes after the world has been washed new. The sky was a high, cloudless blue. The air smelled of damp earth and sagebrush. One morning, Eleanor walked up to the low ridge behind her cabin and saw a herd of antelope flowing like a river of gold through the valley below. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean, cool air. For the first time since Hank's death, she felt a flicker of something that was not grief or duty. It felt like hope. That same day, Evan came to her, his face serious. "Eleanor," he said, "I have an offer. From the telegraph office in Leadville. They have an opening for an apprentice. I would like to take it." Her heart clenched with a mixture of pride and fear. Leadville was a world away. He was all she had left, but she looked at his face, at the determined set of his jaw, and she knew she could not hold him back. "We will find the money for your board," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Later, she told Silas about Evan's opportunity. He listened patiently, and then he made an offer. "I would like to sponsor his apprenticeship." He said, "Consider it a scholarship, the first annual Sterling Mine Scholarship for brave miners. Your brother showed a great deal of courage during this ordeal. He deserves to be rewarded." He had framed it in the only way he knew she could accept, not as charity, but as an honor. That night, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a sense of order seemed to be slowly returning to her world. Justice was coming. Her brother had a future, but there was still the mine, a broken place filled with ghosts. And there was this man, this quiet, steadfast man who made her feel things she was not ready to feel. "When the mine is safe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "when the men can go to work and know they will come home again, then we can talk about the future." Silas looked at her strong, tired face illuminated by the rising moon. He nodded slowly. "When the mine is safe," he agreed. He did not push for more. He understood that for her, safety was not just a condition. It was the very foundation upon which anything else could be built. The court was not held in a building of brick and mortar, but under a vast canvas tent erected in the middle of the town square. It was a space that had served as a revival hall, a dance floor, and a marketplace. Now, it was a hall of justice. The district judge, a man named Elias Thorne with a weathered face and eyes that had seen the full spectrum of human folly, presided from a table set upon the same makeshift platform where Silas Hart had made his stand. The jury box was a row of simple pine benches filled with 12 men from Coyote Ridge, miners and merchants who had been chosen to weigh the fate of their neighbors. The high, blue Colorado sky was the courtroom's ceiling, and a restless wind that billowed the canvas walls was its only interruption. The setting was rustic, yet it held a raw and simple solemnity that no gilded courthouse could match. The evidence was laid out with a methodical precision. The prosecuting attorney, sent from Leadville, presented the stained invoices bearing Vance Cutter's signature and the emergency voucher approved by Ephraim Pike. Dr. Whitcomb took the stand and, in his gruff, no-nonsense manner, described the chemical impurities he had found in the lamp oil, explaining how such a mixture would burn erratically and dangerously hot. He produced a sample of the foul-smelling liquid in a sealed jar, passing it before the jury, whose wrinkled noses confirmed his testimony. The 3 rescued miners, one with his arm still in a clean white sling, gave their halting, emotional accounts of the collapse, each one confirming that Cutter had ordered them into the condemned tunnel against Eleanor's direct, written prohibition. Then came Eleanor's testimony. She did not speak with passion or anger, but with the cool, factual clarity of an expert. She presented her logbook, its pages filled with her neat, careful entries detailing the mine's failing infrastructure. She unrolled the map of the mine, its surface smudged with dirt and rock dust, and showed the jury the bold red chalk line she had drawn across Tunnel 3B. She explained the meaning of the 3 white chalk lines she had used to mark the escape route during the rescue, a system of her own design. Her knowledge was irrefutable, her testimony a quiet indictment of the greed and negligence that had led to the disaster. The lawyer Pike had hired, a slick man from Denver in a suit that looked out of place in the dusty square, did his best to muddy the waters. He argued that the collapse was a tragic act of God, a natural disaster that could not have been foreseen. When Vance Cutter took the stand, he lied with a desperate, sweating conviction. He claimed he had never seen Eleanor's order, that the men had gone into the tunnel on their own accord, looking for a promising new vein of silver. During the cross-examination, the prosecutor deferred to Eleanor, who sat at his table. At her quiet prompting, he asked Cutter a series of technical questions. "Mr. Cutter, can you describe the geological composition of the hanging wall in Tunnel 3B?" Cutter faltered. "It is rock, like the rest of the mine." "Is it granite or shale?" the prosecutor pressed, reading from Eleanor's notes. "I am a foreman, not a geologist," Cutter blustered. "Isn't it true that Tunnel 3B is cut through a vertical seam of unstable shale, making it particularly vulnerable to water saturation from the spring thaw?" Cutter's face went pale. "That is just talk." "It is a fact, Mr. Cutter, a fact that any competent foreman would know. A fact noted in this logbook by the safety forewoman you chose to ignore." He had no answer. His lies, so convincing in the saloon, crumbled into dust under the weight of simple, observable truth. Silas Hart was called to the stand only once. He spoke quietly, his testimony brief and to the point. He confirmed that he had hired Eleanor based on his assessment of her expertise and integrity. When asked by the defense attorney if he stood to profit from the mine's closure and a subsequent drop in its sale price, his answer was direct. "I stand to profit from a mine that does not kill its workers. I have already committed to covering the full cost of making the sterling safe, regardless of the final purchase price. Safety," he concluded, his eyes sweeping over the jury, "is not negotiable." The defense attorney, in his closing statement, made a final, desperate appeal to the jury's prejudice. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we are asked to believe the complex workings of a silver mine can be understood by a woman. It is an absurdity on its face." Judge Thorne, who had been listening with an expression of weary patience, finally looked up from his notes. He peered at the lawyer over the top of his spectacles. "Counselor," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "I have been given to understand that women have a fairly comprehensive knowledge of childbirth, a process which seems to me at least 10 times more complicated and considerably more dangerous than the properties of lamp oil. The jury will disregard your appeal to absurdity." A wave of quiet, appreciative laughter rolled through the tent, and in that moment, the lawyer from Denver lost his case. The jury was out for less than an hour. The verdict was guilty. Vance Cutter was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor for fraud and reckless endangerment. Judge Thorne, citing the overwhelming evidence of a cover-up, summarily removed Ephraim Pike from the office of mayor, pending a full investigation into the town's finances by the district attorney. The former mayor was led away, his face the color of old parchment, his reign of bluster and deceit over. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The truth, once exposed to the open air, seemed to cleanse the community of its old, bitter resentments. The jeering jokes and whispered insults directed at Eleanor now seemed petty and shameful. One evening, as she was walking home from the store, two of the miners who had been most vocal in their ridicule approached her, their hats in their hands. "Mrs. Boone," one of them mumbled, his eyes fixed on the toes of his boots. "About that drawing in the saloon, we are sorry. You were right all along." Eleanor simply nodded, her forgiveness offered in the quiet dignity of her silence. A week after the trial, another notice appeared on the general store's bulletin board. Silas Hart had officially purchased the Sterling mine. The notice went on to detail the terms of the new labor contract. A minimum wage was established for all miners. New, standard-issue safety lamps would be provided by the company, and the position of safety foreman was now a permanent, salaried role, with the full authority to halt any and all operations in the event of a safety concern. That afternoon, Silas came to her cabin. He did not sit on the porch but stood before her, his hat in his hands, his usual seriousness tempered by a new, softer light in his eyes. "Eleanor Boone," he said, his voice formal but warm, "I would like to offer you the permanent position of safety foreman of the Sterling mine. The salary will be equal to that of the production foreman." She looked at him, at this man who had come into her life like a storm and had somehow brought a great and lasting calm. She had her answer ready. "I accept," she said, "on one condition, that a portion of the mine's profits be set aside to establish a permanent fund for the widows and orphans of Coyote Ridge." A slow smile spread across Silas's face. "I believe that can be arranged," he said. That evening, the whole town gathered at the telegraph office. Evan, who was to leave for Leadville in 2 days, had been given the honor of sending the first official message on the newly repaired line. He sat at the key, his face a study in concentration, and then he began to tap. The clatter of the sounder was crisp and clear, a new heartbeat in the center of the town. He was tapping out a simple message, one he had composed himself. "Home is safe." As the letters spelled themselves out on the operator's pad, a spontaneous cheer went up from the crowd. It was a sound of hope, of a future that was no longer buried in the dark, but was reaching out, on a thin copper wire, toward the wide and waiting world. A season turned. The high country summer bled into the sharp, golden light of autumn. The Sterling mine, once a place of ghosts and whispers, now hummed with a new rhythm. It was the sound of steady work, of seasoned timbers set true, of safety lamps casting a bright, unwavering glow in the darkness. The mine was producing again, more silver than ever before, but the real treasure was the silence at the end of each shift, a silence unbroken by the frantic peal of an accident bell. Eleanor Boone was no longer an outcast. She was a respected authority, a fixed point in the town's new moral landscape. The miners, who had once mocked her, now sought her counsel. They called her the Little Boss, a name spoken not with derision but with a rough, affectionate respect for a woman who was small in stature but as tough and unyielding as an ironwood beam when it came to their safety. She was their guardian, their advocate, the one who knew the mountain's moods and would not be swayed by talk of quotas or profits. The change was most evident in the small, quiet moments. One evening, Silas Hart came to her cabin not with ledgers or maps, but with a small, hardy sagebrush plant in an earthenware pot. He set it on her porch step, his large hands looking clumsy as they handled the delicate plant. "For the porch," he said, his voice a little gruff, "they say the scent wards off mosquitoes and bad memories." Eleanor looked from the plant to his serious face. A small smile touched her lips. "Bad memories are a good deal more stubborn than mosquitoes." "Mr. Hart," she said, "but I thank you. It is a kind thought." The evenings grew cooler, the wind carrying the first bite of winter down from the high peaks. They often sat on her porch as twilight settled, the silence between them comfortable and deep. One particularly windy evening, He disappeared into his boarding house and returned with a thick wool blanket. He draped it over her shoulders and then sat beside her on the top step, close enough that he could share a corner of its warmth. The simple, respectful gesture was more intimate than any touch. He told her the story of the scars on his hands that night, of a flash fire on a railroad trestle in his youth, of pulling another man from the flames. She listened, and when he was done, she showed him a small, silvery scar on her own forearm, a mark left by a falling piece of shale years ago. They were not just sharing stories, they were showing each other the places where they had been broken and had healed stronger. The foundation of their growing affection was built on this quiet understanding, this profound respect for the boundaries of each other's lives and bodies. Silas, it turned out, was a determined student. He persisted in his efforts to master the art of coffee making. After weeks of trial and error, he finally produced a cup that was not only drinkable but genuinely good, rich and smooth and without a trace of bitterness. He presented it to her with the nervous pride of a schoolboy showing off a prize. She took a slow, critical sip, her expression thoughtful. She looked at him over the rim of the cup, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well now," she said, her voice laced with a gentle humor, "that is proper coffee. I suppose I could get used to this." She took another sip. "I have always said I could never consider marrying a man whose coffee tasted like medicine." The words hung in the cool air between them, playful yet freighted with a new and serious meaning. The humor in his eyes faded, replaced by the quiet intensity she had come to know so well. He set his own cup down with a steady hand. "Eleanor Boone," he said, his voice low and serious. "I want to build a life here, with you, if you would want that." It was not a question she had been prepared for. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She looked away from his searching gaze, toward the dark silhouette of the mountain. A part of her, a part she had thought long buried, soared at his words. But another, more cautious part, held back. She had to be sure. She had to know that what she felt for him was for the man himself, not for the benefactor who had saved her town and given her a future. "Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I need some time." He did not look disappointed. He simply nodded, his understanding as steady and solid as the mountain itself. "Time is a luxury a mind never gives you," he said softly. "But I will. You can have all the time you need." They continued their work, their quiet partnership now overlaid with a new, unspoken question. They often did a final safety inspection together at the end of the day, walking the quiet tunnels after the last shift had gone home. One evening, as they stood in the main shaft, a beam of the setting sun found its way down a newly cut vertical ventilation shaft. It pierced the gloom in a perfect, golden column, illuminating a swirling universe of airborne silver dust. The tiny particles glittered and danced in the light, a silent, breathtaking snowfall of pure wealth. Eleanor stared at it, mesmerized. "The most beautiful light," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe, "is the one that comes after a long darkness." Their partnership had become a pillar of the community. This was made official at a small ceremony in the town square to inaugurate the Boone Heart Fund for widows and orphans. A simple sign was unveiled, and the townspeople, miners and merchants alike, stepped forward to drop coins into a large glass jar, their small contributions a testament to their shared commitment. Rosalia, her face beaming with pride, served up a massive pot of her famous chili, and for the first time in a long time, the sounds of laughter and easy conversation filled the square. 2 days later, the mail rider brought a letter from Leadville. It was from Evan. Eleanor read it alone on her porch, her heart aching with a mixture of love and loneliness. He was thriving. He wrote with breathless excitement about his studies, about the magic of sending words across a wire. He was at the top of his class. The letter was filled with news and questions, but it was the final line that made her stop and catch her breath. "Do not be afraid of the future, sister," he had written in his new, confident hand. "It is not as dark as the places we have been. She folded the letter, a single tear tracing a path through the fine layer of dust on her cheek. And in that moment, she knew her fear was a ghost, a shadow from a past that was no longer her present. That evening, Silas asked her to walk with him. He led her up the low ridge behind her cabin, to the place where the wild sagebrush grew thick, its scent sharp and clean in the cool evening air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. He stopped and turned to her, his face serious in the fading light. And then, to her complete surprise, he slowly knelt on one knee in the soft, red earth. He took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I am not kneeling to protect you, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was raw and true. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. I am kneeling to ask if I can stand with you, for all the days to come." She looked down at him, at this good, strong, patient man who had seen her not as a problem to be solved or a prize to be won, but as an equal. The last of her doubts dissolved like mist in the morning sun. Her hand tightened on his, and a slow, beautiful smile, a smile that had been absent for too long, lit up her face. "Yes, Silas," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Yes, their wedding was as simple and solid as the mountain itself. They were married under the same large canvas tent that had served as a courtroom, now scrubbed clean and strung with oil lanterns that cast a soft, golden glow. Bunches of wild sagebrush tied with twine filled the air with their clean, sharp scent. There was no flowing white gown or formal suit, just their best clean clothes. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress Rosalia had helped her sew, and Silas wore a new wool coat, though he seemed more comfortable and more himself when he had taken it off and rolled up his sleeves. Dr. Whitcomb, his usual grumpiness softened by the occasion, served as the official witness, reading the vows from a worn book in a voice that was surprisingly steady. The whole town was there, their faces open and happy, their presence a quiet testament to the hard-won peace they had all built together. There was no raucous celebration with barrels of whiskey, just a long table laden with food brought by every family, a shared feast of community. After they had spoken their vows and the judge had pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the crowd. As Silas and Eleanor turned to face their friends and neighbors, an old miner, his face flushed with happiness and Rosalia's good chili, slapped his knee and said a little too loudly, "Well, I will be. To think we used to call her the woman who dug for silver." A brief, awkward silence fell over the tent. The man's wife nudged him sharply in the ribs, but Silas just smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He put his arm around Eleanor's shoulders and drew her close. "I told you all once before," he said, his voice carrying easily through the tent, clear and proud. The town shamed her for working the mine, and the Tycoon said, "That's the woman I want." And I can tell you all now, that was the single wisest decision of my entire life. The cheer that went up this time was twice as loud, a wave of warmth and approval that washed away the last shadows of the past. The next morning, after the town had swept the last of the crumbs from the square, Eleanor and Silas walked to the mine. The new entrance was a marvel of engineering, a wide, arching mouth supported by massive, perfectly fitted timbers. The air that flowed from it was cool and clean. Just inside the entrance, they hung a newly painted wooden sign. It did not bear their names or the name of the company. It simply said, in bold black letters, "The first day under new safety." As the morning shift of miners walked past, each man paused, read the sign, and then tipped his helmet in a silent salute to the woman who stood beside the new owner. A woman who was not just his wife, but their foreman. The future of Coyote Ridge arrived not with a bang, but with the steady, rhythmic clang of a sledgehammer on steel. A new spur line of the railroad, financed by Silas, reached the town by the time the first snows fell, connecting them directly to the world. The town began to thrive. New businesses opened, and families began to build houses with glass windows and painted porches. The Boone Hart Fund for Widows and Orphans, now a formal institution with a board of trustees that included Rosalia and Dr. Whitcomb, awarded its first 2 scholarships, sending the children of miners who had been lost years before to schools in Denver. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. One afternoon, Rosalia stopped Eleanor outside the general store, a mischievous glint in her eye. "So," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "the coffee at the Hart household? Is it still a danger to the digestive system, or has the great Tycoon finally surrendered?" Eleanor laughed, a full, easy sound that was now a familiar part of the town's music. "He has improved," she admitted. "In fact, his coffee is now even sweeter than his words." Most of the time. That evening, as the autumn light faded, Eleanor sat alone in her quiet cabin. She opened the small wooden chest in the corner, the one where she had kept her memories locked away. She took out the delicate lace kerchief, the one she had carried on her wedding day with Hank. For years, it had been a relic of her grief, a symbol of a life that had been shattered. Now, as she held it in her calloused hands, it felt different. It was not a symbol of what she had lost, but a testament to what she had survived. She folded it carefully, not with sadness, but with a quiet, reverent strength. She walked into the small room that now served as her office and placed the handkerchief on the shelf, right beside the hard leather helmet of the Sterling Mine safety foreman. They belonged together. They were both a part of her story. Dignity, she had learned, was not something a crowd could give or take away. It was a fire you tended within yourself. Justice was not an abstract idea, but a choice made by people who dared to speak the truth. And love, true love, was not a grand passion that swept you away, but a quiet, steady partnership built on a foundation of absolute respect. A community, she now knew, could heal. It could learn from its mistakes. It could change, from the ground up, if just one person had the courage to stand up straight. The next day, she and Silas were doing their final inspection. As they stood in the main shaft, the afternoon sun once again found the ventilation shaft, pouring a column of golden light into the heart of the mountain. The air was alive with the glittering dance of silver dust. They stood together in the shimmering light, not in a passionate embrace, but with their hands clasped. A simple, powerful connection that was enough. It was everything. On the surface, Dr. Whitcomb was grumbling to Rosalia as he left his office. "Well," he huffed, "I suppose that is the end of the great bitter coffee epidemic. A true loss for medical science." At that exact moment, the telegraph in the main office began to clatter. The young operator, one of Evan's first students, scribbled down the message as it came in. It was from Evan himself, a weekly report to his sister and his benefactor. Home is safe. It spelled out. The rhythmic clicking of the sounder was like a steady, reassuring heartbeat, a promise sent across the miles. Coyote Ridge was no longer the place that shamed a woman for working a mine. It had become something more. It was a place that remembered a time when its people had stood for what was right, a place that had learned, the hard way, how to keep each other safe. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.